the presidential debate was one of the debates of all time. And despite being absolutely cringe and unhinged in equal measure, I still subjected myself to listen to it. And more importantly, we are going to be taking a look at what each candidate had to say about the war in Ukraine. And we're going to try to see if anybody is even remotely approaching the truth. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Okay, so headphones on, guys. This is, of course, their stances on the Ukraine war. Let's take a listen.
Here again, David Muir and Lindsay Davis.
Welcome back to this historic ABC News presidential debate tonight. We're going to continue here, and I want to turn to the war in Ukraine. We're now 2.5 years into this conflict. Mr. President, it has been the position of the Biden administration that we must defend Ukraine from Russia, from Vladimir Putin, to defend their sovereignty, their democracy, that it's in America's best interest to do so, arguing that if Putin wins, he may be emboldened to move even further into other countries. You have said you would solve this war in 24 hours. You said so just before the break tonight. How exactly would you do that? And I want to ask you a very simple question tonight. Do you want Ukraine to win this war?
I want the war to stop. I want to save lives that are being people being killed by the millions. It's the millions. It's so much worse than the numbers that you're getting, which are fake numbers.
Okay, I want to point these things out. First off, guys, casualties may be approaching 1 million, but it's definitely not in the millions. And one of the things that we're seeing right now is that there's obviously a wide range of estimates, but to say that they are fake is probably, it's just not true. So during the Russia invasion of Ukraine, when we look at total casualties, again, the Russians say that they've had hardly any casualties. Of course, the Ukrainians have been cagey about their total KIA, but they did recently acknowledge again that there was a 31,000 killed. Right. So as you could see here, well, this actually hasn't been updated in a while, which is sort of annoying, but again, you can see that we're estimating about between 300,000 of Russian forces killed and wounded, according to the U.S., 600,000 according to the U.K. Armed Forces of Ukraine reporting 600,000 again killed and wounded. Again, with slightly different dates, you could see the BBC News Russia putting that number quite a bit, well, actually about right, about 130,000 killed, and for every one soldier who's killed, we can expect 3 to 4 casualties. So again, and you're looking at The Economist actually estimating, again, nearly 1 million, or rather 780,000. So most of the way to 1 million. Again, we know that the Russian Ministry of Defense thinks they've killed or wounded 500,000 Ukrainians. That's probably a bit high. But again, 35,000 killed would put it around closer to like 200,000 Ukrainians who have been killed so far in the war, or sorry, 200,000 killed and wounded. So, again, 1 million killed, absolutely not true. There's no estimate by anyone, Russia, Ukraine, BBC, The Economist, the United States, leaked U.S. intelligence. Nobody says that there have been millions killed. The higher end estimates put the death toll of combatants around maybe 300K. And, you know, even if you were to generously say that there have been the same number of civilians killed, which would be absolutely eye-popping. Again, we've seen, especially given how slow the front line progresses, there's almost always ample time for evacuation. So civilian deaths have actually been relatively low compared to something like even the Afghan war, where the lack of a front line meant that civilian areas were constantly under threat. I would be shocked if there was even again 100,000 or 150,000. So Trump off by, if he's saying millions, he's off by probably tenfold. Yeah. Unless, but again, it's so hard to figure out what he really means. Definitely not millions killed. Maybe 1 million if you did killed plus wounded.
than the numbers that you're getting, which are fake numbers. Look, we're in for 250 billion or more because they don't ask Europe, which is a much bigger beneficiary to getting this thing done than we are. They're in for $150 billion less because Biden and you don't have the courage to ask Europe like I did with NATO. They paid billions and billions, hundreds of billions of dollars when I said, either you pay up or we're not going to protect you anymore. So that's maybe one of the reasons they don't like me as much as they like.
Okay, so this is one of those unhinged talking points. Now, one, Trump is good at identifying a problem. And he correctly identified that prior to his administration, actually, and really prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, NATO allies were underspending, right? The general agreement in NATO has been that all NATO countries are expected to spend about 2% of their GDP on defense, right? And so that way, the bigger your economy goes, the more you're expected to contribute, right? But in 2014, the average was about 1.47% of GDP. So yes, NATO allies were underspending, and they knew that they were subsidized by the United States that spends about 3% of its GDP on defense. And you may be thinking, man, those are like pretty small differences given the fact the U.S. military is thought of as being an absolutely massive military. But it's a testament to, again, how massive the U.S. economy is. But really, Trump says he did it. Again, I think they probably saw the increased militarization of Putin and NATO allies after the invasion. Okay, as of 2024, 23 of 32 allies are expected to meet or exceed the 2% target, spending a combined $230 billion on defense. But Trump is doing this thing where he either is trying to confuse voters to think these are intertwined issues. They're related, but not the same. Or he himself is confused. Again, NATO spending, this is on their own militaries. So, for example, the UK, right, increased its defense spending, but it meant that it bought itself. It expanded more soldiers, more tanks, more fighter aircraft, better maintenance, right? But that is distinct from the aid to Ukraine. And here is sort of where he's confused. This is from Statistica, but you can see where, again, it looks like you say, oh, Trump is correct. This is probably the chart that he actually looked at. And again, it's a troubling lack of critical thinking because, as you can see, the United States, a country, we've spent a total of about, this is pinging it at around 75 billion euros. Let's see if we can find a more updated one. No, this is updated to June 2024. So this is about 75 billion euros. So again, there's an exchange rate difference, but EU institutions have spent about 40. What are EU institutions, guys? EU institutions are the collective coffers that all EU countries pay into. And again, they've opened a sort of basically a bank account, for lack of a better term, to say, listen, all EU countries pay in a little bit. And that way they say, listen, as countries, you don't have to do all these little individual deals. The EU is going to collectively sort of do these big aid packages. And that's been the largest single contributor of financial and humanitarian aid to Ukraine. But that is not all of it, right? As you can see, Germany, separate from the EU, but remember, Germany is still a European country, 14 billion. The UK, 13 billion, right? Canada, Denmark, Netherlands, Sweden, France, all have Poland, Finland, Norway, Italy, Belgium, Czechia, Spain, all have contributed over $1 billion additional dollars, or euros, excuse me, to the effort. So let me pull this up for you guys real quick. According to Kiel, which aggregates the actual data, right? Institute for the World Economy here, you can see this is from till June 2024, Europe has allocated a total collectively of 110 billion euros of aid, with another 77 pledged to arrive. The United States allocated 75 billion euros, with another 2023 pledged but not yet arrived. So again, this is Trump just not saying something that is absolutely untrue. Like, this is just not an accurate representation of the way these aid packages have worked.
Like weak people, but you take a look at what's happening. We're in for 250 to 275 billion. They're into 100 to 150. They should be forced to equalize. With that being said, I want to get the war.
Again, as we point out, being forced to equalize would actually mean the U.S. signs bigger checks, right? Excuse me. Yeah, the U.S. would have to sign much larger checks to match Europe's aid. And this makes sense because, as they point out, Europe has an incentive to stop Russia in Ukraine because they will be Putin's next target, right? Again, likely Putin would expand the Ruski Mir to like Belarus and Moldova, but possibly the Baltics. He's explicitly said he wants to add the Baltics to the Ruski Mir. So likely the Baltics would be the biggest targets, but that's still a threat to Europe. So probably pledging some kind of equalization of aid would actually not be in the U.S. best interest. But I also want to point out that if we look at Ukraine aid, because again, Trump's emphasizing $250 billion. That's, again, not really the number we've seen so far. Like 75 billion euros is somewhat less than that. But again, he's in the right ballpark. But here's what I want to point out is that for the United States, it is around 0.35% of GDP. So that is 1/10 of the U.S.'s total defense budget is going to aid Ukraine. And as I've pointed out, a lot of times it's the United States actually getting things it wanted anyway. We've cycled out many of our old artillery equipment. We've cycled out old vehicles, right? That's why you see so many Ukrainians driving around in Cougars and MRAPs. Those are throwbacks from the Iraq and Afghanistan wars that we are going to be phasing out of our arsenal anyway. Artillery systems that are going to be replaced by more up-to-date ones have all gone to Ukraine. So we are doing more like garage sales, and it's hard to price something like an artillery system because, well, frankly, there's not a big market for it, right? And it's hard to price an MRAP. Again, who's going to buy an MRAP? So when you throw around some of these numbers, it can even look higher, I think, than it really is. So the ability to completely cripple and pin down a geopolitical rival like Russia for 0.3% of your GDP is the deal of the century. And I point out that other than U.S. citizens who have volunteered to go to Ukraine with not under the auspices of the U.S. government, no American soldier has been killed in Ukraine. And so that sort of stuff is important, I think, to understand here. In context, the U.S. spends a tiny amount, all right, again, 1/10 of its own defense budget on helping Ukraine, giving them essentially old stuff that we had in our attic that we wanted to replace anyway. Again, the analogy I always use, you have a 2005 Toyota Corolla. It still runs good, but you want a car with a touch screen and a Bluetooth, right? You're tired of having to plug in your CDs from high school. And so you say, listen, your buddy goes, man, dude, I just got in a car wreck. I can't get to work. I don't know what I'm going to do. You say, listen, dude, I'm going to get a new car anyway. Just take the Corolla. I'll write it off on my taxes, and I'm going to get myself like a new slick Lexus. That's what the U.S. military is doing. Okay. So again, when you sit there and go, we're spending so much on aid, that money, we paid for those artillery systems 20 years ago. Now they're just getting a second life instead of being sent to the scrapyard.
Settled. I know Zelensky very well, and I know Putin very well. I have a good relationship, and they respect your president, okay? They respect me. They don't respect Biden. How would you respect him? Why? For what reason? He hasn't even made a phone call in 2 years to Putin, hasn't spoken to anybody. They don't even try and get it. That is a war that's dying to be settled.
Okay, again, I want to point this out. This is something that is true. And we've seen Biden during the debate. He didn't seem to have the cognition to really handle this stuff. But as we talked about, twice Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, in the last 6 months, has actually reached out to, Russia has reached out to Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin. In fact, it happened twice in a month. And again, these are relationships that are essential, right? If you call the defense secretary, and this is Russia that picked up the phone to do some important deconfliction. And again, this, I think, is a significant step to sit there and be like, oh, Biden hasn't called Putin. Well, again, both Biden and Putin are old men, and I think there's an understandable reason Biden hasn't. But the fact that someone as senior as the defense secretary has made 2 contacts in less than a month, with his Russian counterpart, it's unfair to say that the U.S. has not been in touch with Russia and has not been in regular contact. By international standards, having your senior defense official speak twice in 2 months, he probably is in more frequent contact with a Russian defense minister than with the UK's Minister of Defense.
I will get it settled before I even become president. If I win, when I'm president-elect, and what I'll do is I'll speak to one, I'll speak to the other, I'll get them together. That war would have never happened. And in fact, when I saw Putin after I left, unfortunately left because our country has gone to hell, but after I left, when I saw him building up soldiers, he did it after I left, I said, oh, he must be negotiating. It must be a good, strong point of negotiation. Well, it wasn't, because Biden had no...
Okay. Getting both parties into a room to negotiate is absolutely the first step towards a peace plan. But all of Europe has not been able to do so. And no one, not even the Trump administration, has explained how he's going to get them to sit down together, right? There is no way, or rather, no one has figured out how to do it without some kind of substantive change to the battlefield situation. And, as I've talked about, both sides are coming to the realization that neither one probably has the military capacity to achieve either of their original objectives in full, right? For the Ukrainians, they are not going to be able to throw the Russians out of eastern Ukraine entirely. It's not even clear that they'll be able to really reverse territorial gains on the battlefield. And in turn, Putin has realized that other than tiny incremental gains in Donetsk, he's unlikely to make substantial gains in Ukraine. So what they're right now sort of both at the point where they acknowledge privately that there will have to be some kind of territorial concession, right? But neither one wants to sit there and feels that they're ready to sit down. That's the problem. So again, it's one of those things that is if you've never done any international diplomacy, you would think that it's that easy. Be like, Putin, come have dinner with me. We're going to get a steak. It's going to be great. And then they go, oh, Zelensky's here too. You guys got to talk it out. Like, that's not how statecraft works. And the fact that he was president and he still thinks that's how it works is actually pretty stupid.
No idea how to talk to him. He had no idea how to stop it. And now you have millions of people dead, and it's only getting worse, and it could lead to World War III. Don't kid yourself, David. We're playing with World War III, and we have a president that we don't even know if where is our president? We don't even know if he's a president.
And just to clarify
they threw him out of a campaign like a dog. We don't even know. Is he our president? But we have a president,
Mr. President,
that doesn't know he's alive.
Your time is...
Okay. So I'm fairly certain President Biden knows he's alive. He does seem to be able to give like short press conferences. Yeah, he's clearly very old. Again, I think most people I've talked to have said he's showing many of the signs of Parkinson's. But again, you're not dead if you have Parkinson's, and you're not like a vegetable. And as I point out, that he is not the candidate for president. So it is, I don't really know what the point of that was. I think his argument is that there was a miscalculation about the seriousness of Putin's intentions. But we now know that when Putin was building up his military forces, it was not a negotiation. Putin was building them up because he intended to invade. And as we've talked about in this war, you cannot conduct a military operation at scale at the drop of a hat, right? You have to build up your forces. So Putin, by the time he was building up his forces, had likely already committed to invade Ukraine. So the idea that there could be a last-minute negotiation or coercion, it would be possible, right? You can avert war up till the last second, up until the first shot's fired, but Putin likely already committed to that course of action. Remember, Putin believed that his military could roll into Ukraine, get to Kiev, flip the regime in 3 days, and prevent or expand kind of the Russian sphere of influence by installing a friendly regime. So again, to sit there and say it was the U.S.'s responsibility to stop Putin conducting this years-long, the preparation likely was months or years in the making. And so again, by the time he was building up forces at the border, to say that there was a real chance at negotiation is untrue. Here's the thing that I think was actually, and I'm going to make a larger strategic point here. It seemed like Kamala Harris's team was actually like telling her, let Trump talk. Because you notice she just looks at him like he's a crazy person. And the fact is that Trump has this character trait where he just talks and talks and talks. And he says stuff that is wrong or stupid or unhinged. And as we've just talked about, we've made it 3 minutes into it. Vice President Harris has said nothing. And Trump has said just a bunch of stuff that is like just absolutely a mischaracterization of the conflict. And actually, while we're paused for a sec, I do want to ask you two things. First, is to hit subscribe. That does make a difference for my channel. Oh my gosh, we're 20 minutes into this video. Oh my God, we're 3 minutes in. This is why this was exhausting. Also, if you want to support me, I'm not for sale. I've had governments reach out and try to get me on message, but I've told them to go pound sand. And the reason I can do that is because I have you guys, the audience, supporting me over on combatvetnews.com. If you want to do it, the link is in the description. Specialists get you access to uncensored, like combat footage from the front lines. We do a deep dive analysis, GoPro, drone footage, crazy stuff. We actually just saw the Russian perspective, Russian GoPro footage of an FPV drone attack, which was absolutely crazy. But if you want the Q&A, that's lieutenant tier, and you want the shout outs, that's a colonel tier. Link is in the description. Just do it. Okay, let's try to get this show on the road a little more.
Up just to clarify in the question, do you believe it's in the U.S. best interest for Ukraine to win this war? Yes or no?
I think it's the U.S. best interest to get this war finished and just get it done.
All right.
Negotiate a deal, because we have to stop all of these human lives from being destroyed.
I want to take this to Vice President Harris. I want to get your thoughts on support for Ukraine in this moment, but also as Commander-in-Chief, if elected, how would you deal with Vladimir Putin, and would it be any different from what we're seeing from President Biden?
Well, first of all, it's important to remind the former president you're not running against Joe Biden, you're running against me. I believe the reason that Donald Trump says that this war would be over within 24 hours is because he would just give it up. And that's not who we...
If that is the only way you could end the war that quickly, like, period. The only way would be, honestly, even then, Ukraine would continue to fight. The only way you could truly end it in 24 hours is to, like, actually threaten Ukraine. Like, the only way to do that would be to call Zelensky and be like, listen, not only are we not supporting you, but we're going to begin providing large-scale military aid to Russia. And so you need to sit with Putin and accept this level of deals. Or maybe you could threaten, be like, hey, tell Putin, like, if you don't, or you could intervene. I guess you could also say the U.S. military is going to deploy to Poland, and if Putin doesn't withdraw his troops to the Donbas region or something, the U.S. military will commit to fighting this war. again, would this be popular or smart? No, but that level of credible threat might be enough. So basically, those are the two strategies you could use: is the full weight of the U.S. military intervening directly in the Ukraine war, and its credible threat. But that, or you could just let Ukraine just be like, Ukraine can lose. And unfortunately, again, I think she's probably right, because when the chips were down for Ukraine, right, when they were asking for the aid prior to the invasion in 2019, you saw that, again, the whole Trump impeachment was because he actually delayed about $400 million in aid, including a lot of anti-tank weapons. And we know that based on how close the Battle of Kiev was to taking Kiev, we know that literally the Ukrainians were likely down to, like, here's how close Russia came to Kyiv. You could see that Russia was, let's see, we'll use the outermost region of Kyiv. They were within 20 kilometers of Kyiv. So we're looking at, again, a situation where even a few dozen or a few hundred javelins probably were decisive in this war. So I point that out simply because, again, without a plan, we only have Trump's previous actions to go on, and his previous actions have indicated that he does not view Ukraine as like a particularly important ally.
We are as Americans. Let's understand what happened here. I actually met with Zelensky a few days before Russia invaded, tried through force to change territorial boundaries, to defy one of the most important international rules and norms, which is the importance of sovereignty and territorial integrity. And I met with President Zelensky. I shared with him American intelligence about how he could defend himself. Days later, I went to NATO's eastern flank, to Poland and Romania.
Right. The reason she did that, guys, was the reason these events happened the way they do is because the U.S. got this intelligence. You might recall at the initial outset of the invasion, Zelensky actually said publicly to the Ukrainian people, he said, I don't think Russia's invading. I think this is some kind of strong arm negotiating tactic. He was not right, and the U.S. was right. So the U.S. tried everything, in fact, to get Zelensky to activate his armed forces, to mobilize them for war, because they were certain that Putin had committed to the invasion, which, one, as we talked about, the time for negotiation had ended at that point. Putin was committed to the invasion. And so they said, listen, we're going to send our vice president to tell you this, because there's the message, which is our intelligence is strong that Russia's going to invade your country. But when you really emphasize the message by choosing an emphatic medium and by saying, listen, you're one of 250 countries in the world, but we are sending our vice president to tell you this message personally. That is how confident the United States is that we're going to have, again, our number two person, probably our most articulate. Like, again, at the time, they probably knew how far Biden had fallen off. They were probably like, listen, you have to go and you have to tell him and get him to believe it, right? And again, to whatever extent it worked enough that the Russians did not make it to Kiev, but only barely.
And through the work that I and others did, we brought 50 countries together to support Ukraine in its righteous defense. And because of our support, because of the air defense, the ammunition, the artillery, the javelins, the Abrams tanks that we have provided, Ukraine stands as an independent and free country. If Donald Trump were president, Putin would be sitting in Kyiv right now. And understand what that would mean, because Putin's agenda is not just about Ukraine. Understand why the European allies and our NATO allies are so thankful that you are no longer president, and that we understand the importance of the greatest military alliance the world has ever known, which is NATO, and what we have done to preserve the ability of Zelensky and the Ukrainians to fight for their independence. Otherwise, Putin would be sitting in Kyiv with his eyes on the rest of Europe, starting with Poland. And why don't you?
Okay, I think that's not accurate. Poland would not likely be his target. Again, we talk a lot on this channel about the Ruski Mir. And the Ruski Mir is Putin's term for the greater Russian world, or sort of a Russian imperialist notion. And it is the driving force for this. It's part of a kind of 90s intellectual movement of Russian ultranationalism, that it meant different things to different people. But his Ruski Mir, you can see here, right after the invasion, he believes that basically Moscow should be the metropole of a huge, sprawling, what he describes as civilization, of not just Russian speakers, but kind of Slavs in general. And it has a lot of, if it sounds a little World War II Germany like, it's because it kind of is. And let's see if we can find a map, Ruski Mir map. Here we go. So here is the perception of, there's different perceptions of what might constitute the Ruski Mir, but this is probably a pretty good map of what they believe are places where ethnic Russians sort of live. But you can see that some of them include NATO countries like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Kazakhstan, right? Now, the Kazakhstan is already under the Russian influence. Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan, all already sort of de facto puppet states of Putin. Georgia is an independent country, but again, Putin's actively working to try to subvert it, and it did, right? Remember, in 2008, Putin did invade Georgia, changed the regime, withdrew to ensure that Georgians remained not had a government that was pro-Russian enough. Armenia and Azerbaijan, we know that Armenia has actually turned against Putin, that Russian peacekeepers have expressly been supporting Azerbaijani efforts, and that has, of course, isolated Armenia. So, again, Putin views Azerbaijan as probably the more important ally, likely because they have pretty robust oil industry. But you can see, again, Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus are all part of this Ruski Mir project. So here's kind of the Ruski Mir project. Think of this as stuff that Putin views as already his own. Georgia and Azerbaijan, Putin views as already appropriately submissive to his desires. And then you have Ukraine, again, where he's currently bogged down in conflict. Moldova, that's largely pro-Russian, but actually sort of in conflict, right? It's back and forth. There are some Russian compromised political parties. Belarus firmly in the Russian sphere, and Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania firmly against Russian incursion. So again, I don't think it's fair to say he's going to be looking at Poland, but you can see why she really wants this Polish-American talking point.
You tell the 800,000 Polish Americans right here in Pennsylvania how quickly you would give up for the sake of favor and what you think is a friendship with what is known to be a dictator who would eat you for lunch.
Vice President Harris, thank you. We've heard from both of you on Ukraine tonight. Afghanistan came up in the last hour. I wanted her to respond to something you said earlier, and I'll give you a minute here.
Putin would be sitting in Moscow, and he wouldn't have lost 300,000 men and women, but he would have been sitting in.
He actually gets the number almost correct, which is interesting. Or he's in the normal range. So again, it's funny that he says, "Oh, there's secret numbers that you don't know that I know that say millions have died," but then he's able to give out the actual correct number of estimated Russian military members who are killed. So it says that either there's secret numbers that he just talked about or there's real ones. And that's probably why President Harris is looking at him like he's an idiot, because again, this is somebody who is just, he doesn't have a good understanding, or more likely he is so prone to exaggeration that it's only like an accident that he says true facts.
In Moscow, quiet please. He would have been sitting in Moscow, much happier than he is right now. But eventually, he's got a thing that other people don't have. He's got nuclear weapons. They don't ever talk about that. He's got nuclear weapons. Nobody ever thinks about that. And
okay, again, I understand that in the commentary world, we don't acknowledge that Putin is a nuclear armed state. But one of the things that came out recently is that the administration actually was really what's the word I want? Was absolutely, yeah, here we go. That the nuclear risk during the Russian invasion of Ukraine was actually something that the CIA director prepared frantically for. And again, as they talk about, right, here's the CSIS, or Center for International Strategic Studies, saying that in the fall of 2022, U.S. faced what may have been its most dangerous nuclear crisis in decades. This was during the when Putin initially invaded Ukraine. There was a lot of worries, and then there were a lot of worries as Russian forces were dealt two pretty big defeats in Kharkiv and Kherson. And that behind closed doors, the United States urgently planned for a Russian nuclear strike and worked tirelessly to ensure that Putin understood the consequences that would bring, and that there were clear consequences to using a nuclear weapon. Again, so to sit there and say things like no one thinks about it, no one talks about it, in policy circles, it's always talked about. Even on this channel, we acknowledge that existence, like we've been very honest about it, but it's not the same thing. It is, at this point in the war, not really on the table. Again, if Putin didn't use it in Kharkiv and Kherson as his forces were being rolled back, if he didn't use it to take Kiev at the outset of the invasion, it's unlikely that he would choose to use it now.
Eventually, maybe he'll use them, and maybe he hasn't been that threatening, but he does have that, something we don't even like to talk about. Nobody likes to talk about it. But just so you understand, they sent her to negotiate peace before this war started. 3 days later, he went in and he started the war because everything they said was weak and stupid. They said the wrong things. That war should have never started. She was the emissary. They sent her in to negotiate with Zelensky and Putin.
Again, when you're 72 hours out from an invasion, there's not, at that point, Putin had committed to the invasion. And her goal was to get Zelensky to recognize that. So again, this is something that, again, it's not clear. Maybe Trump knows that this is not the case and he is simply like fabricating a new narrative. Or he is actually doesn't understand, again, sort of the military planning process. Again, it's not like he needs to know MDMP, but as a president, you should understand how long does it take to prepare the military for an operation, for a small one, for a large one, for an invasion level event. And those kind of timelines should tell you that you're probably by the last 72 hours, at that point, you're like filling up. You're gassing up your trucks, you're filling up your water buffaloes. All the rest of the plan is in place and ready to roll. And
she did. And the war started 3 days later. And that's the kind of talent we have with her. She's worse than Biden. In my opinion, I think he's the worst president in the history of our country. She goes down as the worst vice president in the history of our country. But let me tell you something. She is a horrible negotiator. They sent her in to negotiate. As soon as they left, Putin did the invasion.
President Trump, thank you. You did bring up something. You said she went to negotiate with Vladimir Putin. Vice President Harris, have you ever met Vladimir Putin? Can you clarify tonight?
Yet again, I said it at the beginning of this debate, you're going to hear a bunch of lies coming from this fellow. And that is another one. When I went to meet with President Zelensky, I've now met with him over 5 times. The reality is it has been about standing as America always should, as a leader upholding international rules and norms, as a leader who shows strength, understanding that the alliances we have around the world are dependent on our ability to look out for our friends and not favor our enemies because you adore strongmen instead of caring about democracy.
Yeah, this is one of the things that she's sort of obliquely referring to Taiwan and China, right? And China is looking at Russia's invasion of Ukraine and saying, listen, if we invade Taiwan, we're basically going to be opposed by the same group of people who are opposing Russia in Ukraine, right? The West and the United States. And so they're asking themselves, they're saying, how strong is that commitment? what tools is the West willing to use to defend places, sort of far-flung allies? And that question is something that the Chinese are very eager to know the answer to. They're eager to know the answer to what are the limits of Western aid. And that's one of the reasons why, one, again, she's letting Trump dig himself into this hole here. But more importantly, I think she isn't committing to say we can provide aid for 2 more years, for 3 more years, for 4 more years. One, because Putin will say, oh, okay, I know exactly how long. I set my watch and I know how long I need to do this. So she's saying we're going to defend as long as it takes. Now, privately, that's probably not what the United States stance is. But what they don't want to do is tell Putin, oh, yeah. For example, Putin knows that if he can make it, if Trump says, listen, I'm committing to end the war in 24 hours, Putin knows he needs to extend the war to November and 1 day. And then he'll be able to get any terms he wants because Trump needs to make good on his promise, right? So if somebody said, listen, I guarantee that I will end the war in 24 hours. If somebody said, I guarantee I will buy your car. You're selling your car. I promise you, I will buy it within 24 hours. If somebody says, okay, what are you going to charge them for the car? Are you going to really, can they negotiate at all? No, you've committed. You've said I'm going to buy the car in 24 hours. So what you do is you don't listen to anything they have to say. You say the price of the car is $1 million and you wait until 11:59 at the end of the deadline. And then they have no choice, right? And so again, this timeline-based commitment is problematic for any politician because it means that they actually lose the ability to negotiate. Whereas someone with who has no defined timeline can negotiate, knows that the only timeline is a good deal. And again, for someone who says they're a top-tier negotiator, this is kind of a weird choice, a weird thing to stake out, to put yourself on an artificial timeline.
And that is very much what is at stake here. The President of the United States is commander-in-chief, and the American people have a right to rely on a president who understands the significance of America's role and responsibility in terms of ensuring that there is stability and ensuring we stand up for our principles and not sell them for the benefit of personal flattery.
We've talked about Ukraine and Vladimir Putin. I do want to talk about Afghanistan. It came up in the first...
Okay, well, I'm not interested in Afghanistan. Listen, this was some pretty unhinged shit. I don't know what else to tell you. And again, I think this was the strategy for Harris going into this debate, where she was like, listen, I'm going to let this dude talk because he's going to sound like a psychopath. And frankly, he did, right? Like I'm not an American Democratic stooge by any means. And on this channel, I've been more critical of the administration and the Democrats. They're slow walking Ukraine aid. I called for Biden to drop out. But Trump seems to have such a limited understanding of statecraft, despite having served as president. And given the fact that many of his former officials have come out and said, hey, this person's kind of an idiot. It was a pretty troubling debate, especially around Ukraine. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Again, subscribe if you can. It's free. And if you want to check us out, combatvetnews.com. Bill Collier, Robin Colburn, Gaius Margine, Gina Cuesta, Chris Gorsuch, Francis Karius, AL90, Petya Tururu. Thank you guys for being Colonel tier members. Thank you to our Lieutenant tier members. I really couldn't do this without you guys. I appreciate you all so much. And I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.